It was a perfect plan. On the night of the 11th of June, 1962, 3 prisoners broke out of Alcatraz. They made it to the shore of San Francisco Bay and into a cold and treacherous sea. Almost every detail of the epic escape was uncovered, but half a century on, one intriguing question remains. Did they drown in the notorious dark waters of San Francisco Bay, or did they make it out alive? The confounding case has never been closed, but compelling new evidence has emerged that may shed new light on the legendary Alcatraz breakout. In the prison dubbed the Rock, one fateful night began like any other.
Okay, rack 'em.
Quiet, orderly. Yet guards had no clue that 3 inmates were preparing for what was thought to be impossible. An escape from America's infamous and most secure federal penitentiary. A forbidding fortress looming out of the San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz was home to America's most hardened criminals. Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly were among the inmates who did hard time on the Rock. By the 1960s, prisoners knew that Alcatraz was the end of the line. Its walls, floors, and reinforced bars were thought to be escape-proof. Even the name was enough to scare inmates into submission. Former Alcatraz prison guard Pat Marney once skippered the boat that ferried inmates and guards to and from Alcatraz Island. It was the treacherous sea surrounding Alcatraz that made it so formidable. The only sure way to survive a crossing was by boat. But the freezing water of San Francisco Bay was just one of many supposedly impregnable defenses. One guard for every 3 prisoners prowled the corridors inside. Barbed wire and guard towers ringed the cell block outside. Nothing was permitted inside a 200-meter perimeter offshore. Designed to smash the hopes of the most ingenious escape artist, Alcatraz was nicknamed the Rock. But prisoners Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin found cracks in the Rock's defenses. Many inmates dreamed of breaking out, but few dared try. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were known as lifelong criminals and cunning escape artists. They were sent to the Rock after masterminding dozens of escape attempts at some of America's toughest penitentiaries. Together, they dared to take on the toughest of them all. Obsessed with finding a way out, they spotted a critical weakness within the Rock's forbidding walls. An old ventilation shaft in the roof above B Block wasn't sealed with concrete like the others. If they could open it and squeeze through, they could make it out onto the roof. But to get to the ventilator, They had to get out of their cells. Apart from the impregnable cell doors, a small rectangular metal grate was the only other way out. But behind that grate was a narrow utility corridor crammed with pipes that led directly to the vulnerable ventilation duct. If they could only get through the grate, they could get onto the roof. A network of conspirators soon provided the tools they needed. Fellow inmates employed in the kitchens, laundries, and prison workshops. Former inmate Darwin Kuhn claims that when one of the Anglin brothers asked him to help with getting tools, he offered to do anything he could. A drill was crafted out of spare parts. Sharpened spoons were used to gouge into the concrete walls. Once they'd removed the original steel grates, they replaced them with replicas made of cardboard and tobacco boxes. It took months to get through to the air vent leading up to the roof. On the night of the 11th of June, they were finally ready to go. But there was still one critical job to take care of. Guards were constantly on patrol, conducting random head counts. An empty bed would soon be spotted. Their ingenious solution was a masterstroke. Wire frames, plaster, soap, and real hair were used to craft replicas of their own heads. One of the Anglin brothers worked in the barber's shop. Getting the hair they needed was not a problem. At the allotted time, the dummy heads were put in place, and the three escapees said good night to Alcatraz. The first part of the plan worked perfectly. But although they had made it on and off the roof, they faced the most challenging obstacle of all, the chilling waters of San Francisco Bay. They were all too aware that other escapees had made it this far, only to drown in the treacherous sea. Exposed to the notoriously cold and dangerous water, they wouldn't have stood a chance. They had planned ahead, somehow procuring life jackets, and raincoats they'd stitched together to make an inflatable life raft.
John Anglin asked me, he said, "You got a raincoat?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Wear it out in the yard, and I'll wear it back in." So that's how he got my raincoat, which wound up in the rubber raft that they made.
It took months of ingenious work and more than 50 rubber raincoats to make the watertight raft.
Redo this piece, okay?
They'd even brought a modified squeeze box with them to inflate it. But it was impossible to test the raft beforehand, and a perilous 3-kilometer crossing to the mainland lay ahead of them. If the raft failed, they would have to swim for it, and almost certainly drown. But if it all held together, they would have pulled off a miraculous escape. When the 3 escapees launched off the rock that June night, they were never seen again. Their spectacular vanishing act became the stuff of a legend that lives on today.
It was a wonderful escape attempt, and they disappeared. So there's a mystery there.
A mystery that's back in the spotlight, thanks to fresh, compelling evidence surrounding the Alcatraz breakout. It's been 50 years since 3 inmates infamously slipped out of the supposedly escape-proof maximum security jail at Alcatraz. It's another case for Deputy Marshal Michael Dyke. He's inherited the ongoing search for Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin. It's up to U.S. Marshals to catch fugitives.
Hey, Kelly, it's Mike from the Marshals.
Tens of thousands are recaptured across America every year.
Do you remember his original charge in California?
But this case is different.
Appreciate it. Bye.
Going back and forth, so we like to catch them.
With contemporary murderers and sex offenders at large, the 1962 escape from Alcatraz isn't the most pressing case, but it's still important to him.
Anytime there's a likelihood that someone's still alive and the case needs to be solved, you should never give up until it's done. The Marshal Service never gives up looking for people, no matter what. Nobody gets a free ride, that's for sure.
The Deputy Marshal has digitized thousands of old files. He follows any leads from his San Francisco office. Some believe he's chasing ghosts, but Deputy Michael Dyke's meticulous work has shed dramatic new light on the Alcatraz breakout. He's challenging the assumptions of previous investigations after sifting through the evidence, starting on that fateful morning 50 years ago when an Alcatraz guard made a shocking discovery.
We had a standing count at 7:30 in the morning.
Morris.
The officer went to wake him by slapping him on the head. The officer jumped back and said, "Oh my God, they cut his head off."
The spoon proves mightier than the bars at supposedly escape-proof Alcatraz prison. 3 bank robbers, Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin, scratched their way through grills covering an air vent, climbed a drainage pipe, and disappeared from the forbidding rock in San Francisco Bay. It appears to be the first successful escape in the history of the maximum security prison.
Jolene Babiak was the associate warden's daughter. She was asleep in the family quarters when the alarm was raised.
Well, my first knowledge of the escape was the siren, which appeared in my dreams. My mother met me on the stairs and she said, "Get dressed, there's been an escape." And my first question was, "Do you think they're still here?" And she said, "Nah, they probably left last night."
FBI agents, police and army units were scrambled to search the rocky coastline and icy waters of the San Francisco Bay. Not a trace of the escapees was found. A search of the missing prisoners' cells revealed their route to freedom.
They came off the cell house up there, came down a pipe, came down through here, and they put the raft in the water.
Interviews with other inmates led to another surprise. A fourth conspirator, Alan West, was also in on the escape plan.
Wes was the sneakiest and the most dangerous. He was actually on Alcatraz twice.
But West couldn't break through his cell in time to join the others. He told FBI agents that the escapees planned to follow an unexpected route. Towards Angel Island, some 3 kilometers north of Alcatraz, then crossing to the mainland to steal a car.
That was the plan, to go to Angel Island.
Exactly.
Agents swarmed the area, but the only signs of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were a paddle, 2 life jackets, and a small rubber packet containing photographs and notes. Reports claimed that perhaps the most crucial physical evidence, the makeshift inflatable raft, was never found. No cars were reported stolen. Five weeks later, the FBI received new information. The crew of a Norwegian freighter leaving the bay spotted a body in the water.
They said it was face down, but it was wearing very light blue denim-type pants and an AVP jacket.
The description matched the uniforms worn by Alcatraz prisoners. This report convinced many investigators that the escapees' raft failed and dumped them into a watery grave. But was there another ending to the epic story? Almost 2 decades later, in 1979, the FBI passed the case on to United States Marshals. America's oldest federal law enforcement agency has been hunting and catching fugitives for more than 2 centuries. The Marshals arrest more than 100,000 wanted people every year. A surprising number of them have been on the run for years, even decades. But the 50-year-old Alcatraz case is a unique challenge, even for the most determined marshal. The trail has long gone cold. It's assumed that the 3 escapees probably never made it to freedom. Assistant Director of Investigations Michael Earp has tackled hundreds of difficult cases.
You start from the beginning. You take the case file, everything known at that time, and you review everything that you have. And you try to reconstruct in your own mind what was done back in those days. And you look for different investigative avenues that you think you might want to pursue that weren't pursued before.
When the U.S. Marshals inherited the Alcatraz case, the FBI reports weren't computerized.
You're now asking the FBI, okay, collect all the leads and all the reports, all the evidence and everything, box them up, and send it over to the Marshal Service. The reality of that is it took just about 2 years to get all the case files.
As deputies reviewed the files, one glaring factor stood out. There was no evidence that the fugitives had committed any further crimes.
These guys were career criminals. They didn't know anything else but to commit crimes. They commit a big crime, they escape from Alcatraz, and all of a sudden, there's nothing.
If the 3 had somehow survived the escape, could they have kept clean after breaking the rock? Most investigators think not.
None of them showed up on any new violations. So that told me that these guys aren't around, they're dead.
Former Assistant Director Art Roderick also worked the case. For him, the deciding factor is the icy waters of the San Francisco Bay.
To fight the tides and the cold water, which to me is probably the thing that did them in. I just think they didn't make it. They drowned in the bay and were swept out to the ocean.
If the prisoners did head north towards Angel Island, they would have faced a current twice as strong as that in the waters to the south. Their lives depended on their makeshift raft.
If their raft did not sink, then I think it's very possible that 3 gentlemen paddling as hard as they can could have made it to Angel Island, given what the currents were doing. To me, it ultimately comes down to whether they had a seaworthy vessel or not.
But that question is almost impossible to answer because the raft was never found. Or was it? Deputy Marshal Michael Dyke has uncovered new evidence that turns this most basic assumption on its head. It suggests the fugitives may have beaten the odds after all. Some 50 years after the infamous Alcatraz breakout, U.S. Marshals combed the massive National Archives in San Francisco.
Okay, thank you.
Among the hundreds of thousands of files were the original records of the 3 inmates who broke out of the supposedly escape-proof jail in 1962. Escapee Frank Morris stood out as a typical tragic case. He was an orphan who went from one foster home to another before landing in reform school. He was just 14 when this mugshot was taken. He had a long criminal record, but Frank Morris was no fool. His IQ score was among the top 3% of the population.
The records draw a picture of him as a guy who was above average intelligence, but also liked to get into trouble, probably because he was bored.
As he grew older, he settled into a pattern that would define his adult life. Bank heists, armed robberies, and many spells behind bars, interrupted by brazen escapes. By the time he was shipped to Alcatraz, Frank Morris had earned a reputation as a canny escape artist.
The Anglin brothers were kind of the opposite of Morris. They weren't terribly bright, they were average. One of them had about a 5th grade education and the other one had a 3rd grade education.
They were stealing cars, stealing money, breaking into businesses, breaking into residences. They are listed as armed and dangerous as escapees, but there's not a lot of violence in their history.
The Alcatraz records painted telling portraits of the escape artists as young men. But it was a few documents among the thousands of FBI files that contained a big surprise. Two records that had been kept secret emerged from the archive. Records that led to a stunning new development in the 50-year-old Alcatraz legend. Officials claimed a raft was never found, but just a day after the escape, an FBI record indicated clearly that a raft was recovered from Angel Island. The very next day, a government memorandum made the same claim, but added a startling detail. Footprints were spotted leading away from the raft. But if a raft was recovered, it was never entered into evidence. How that happened and why the documents were buried in the archive remains unknown. The government memorandum, dated 2 days after the escape, packed another bombshell. It's been long accepted that no cars were reported stolen at the time of the Alcatraz escape, a key argument against the fugitive's survival. But the day after the escape, police departments in the Bay Area were on the lookout for a stolen car. According to the government memo, a driver was forced off the road by 3 men in a blue Chevy. He phoned the highway patrol in Stockton to complain. incredible scenario started to become plausible. If the raft held together, the escapees reached Angel Island and made their way over the shallow strait to the mainland. As dawn broke, they stole a car. By the time their empty cells were discovered, they were already racing toward freedom. An amazing story, supported by 2 key documents hidden in the vast FBI archive.
A hunch is a hunch, it's an opinion, and my opinion is that there's a fairly high likelihood that at least 2 of them probably survived.
But if 2 fugitives survived, what became of the third? Perhaps it was his body that was spotted by the crew of a Norwegian freighter. They reported a floating corpse in the San Francisco Bay.
And about 8 months after the escape and 7 months after the body was seen floating, skeletal remains were found in early 1963 up at Point Reyes, which, according to studies on ocean currents, a lot of the currents would follow northward up there, and there's a possibility it could be the same body.
Were they the remains of one of the Alcatraz fugitives? Perhaps DNA testing could answer the question. But first, the bones had to be found.
Hey, Debbie. Mike from the Marshals.
Deputy Marshal Michael Dyke went to the county coroner's office, where a report was logged in 1963. It said the remains were buried in a local cemetery under the name John Bones Doe.
The advantage I have now that they didn't have in 1962 and 63 is I can dig the bones up and send them to a DNA lab and get DNA results from them.
The original coroner's report provided a potential breakthrough. The condition and lengths of the bones were carefully noted by the medical examiner.
And those measurements gave the pathologist the conclusion that the person was approximately 67 1/2 inches in height, which just so happens to be the exact height of Frank Morris.
The similarity in height was a compelling clue, but there was only one way to be sure if the remains were those of Frank Morris: DNA testing. Deputy Dyke went to the local cemetery to exhume the bones. Even if he could find them, there was no guarantee that viable DNA was preserved within them.
Do you happen to know how many bodies that you ended up with here from 62, 63 time frame?
Yeah, there's 4 of them that are buried in this area here that are John Doe's from 62 to 64.
Okay. There we go.
Select the dog.
That's what we want.
That's one of them. All right.
Awesome.
Okay.
The Marin County coroners and I dug up the bones and delivered them to the DNA lab, and they will hopefully extract some DNA from them that we can use for comparison to a reference sample from a relative of the escapees. And I'll start with Frank Morris.
He needed a reference sample to determine whether the bones belonged to the highly intelligent escape artist, Frank Morris. A definitive answer would raise another question. Why did Frank Morris drown and not one of the Anglin brothers who escaped with him? Frank Morris had a reputation as a loner. Rumors suggested the Anglin brothers didn't like him. Perhaps as they paddled toward Angel Island, the brothers decided to go it alone. If he was beaten or thrown out of the raft, Frank Morris would have stood little chance in the cold water and treacherous currents. If it was Morris who died, it would explain why most reported sightings were those of the Anglin brothers. They reportedly went to a family funeral, dressed as women. They were also allegedly spotted at a remote cabin belonging to a distant relative. When he was serving in the US Marshals, former Assistant Director Art Roderick received another, more dramatic alleged eyewitness report.
We had received probably around a 6-page letter about how this person's relative had picked up the Anglin brothers in San Francisco Bay and had been paid to drive them up to an area in Seattle.
The driver got as far as a park on the outskirts of Seattle when he decided to double-cross the infamous Anglin brothers.
This person had got it in his head that, hell, I'm going to go ahead and kill these guys, and apparently they had some cash on him and he was going to steal the money. They had him in the back of a van, kind of covered up. They opened the doors to the vehicle, and he ended up shooting him. And the story was they buried him right on that spot.
The unusual detail in the letter convinced him to investigate the scene of the alleged double murder. He led a team of deputies to look for the alleged burial site. Following precise directions, they thought they had found the exact location. They started digging, but never found a thing.
So it was a heck of a story, but it was all fiction.
Other alleged sightings, fingerprint searches, and surveillance operations failed to solve the mystery of the missing Alcatraz escapees. But what of the exhumed bones suspected to belong to escapee Frank Morris? If DNA testing could confirm they were his, US Marshals could at last account for one fugitive in a 50-year-old manhunt. Were these the remains of Alcatraz escape artist Frank Morris? The bones were found on the coast north of Alcatraz and had been buried for decades. DNA was extracted from the bones, but investigators needed a sample from a relative to compare it to. Deputy Marshal Michael Dyke found a possible member of Morris's paternal family. He agreed to donate a DNA sample, but the test, and the much-anticipated result, would take time.
How you doing, Coon? How you doing, Coon? They're great.
5 decades ago, the bars of a prison cell separated inmate Darwin Coon and prison guard Pat Marney. They met again just a few kilometers from Alcatraz.
Well, I'm so glad to see you.
Yes, yes. Here's to that.
And there's not many of us left, is there?
No, there's not.
It's really getting short.
The mystery surrounding the daring Alcatraz breakout escape still intrigued them. But they had different opinions as to the outcome.
I'd say the probably chance they didn't make it. The water is just, this water here is violent. That's why Alcatraz worked. It was the water.
My positive thinking is that John and Clarence Anglin and Frankie Morris, those 3 guys got away.
Whatever happened to them, the fact that they made it out of a supposedly escape-proof prison had a far greater impact than they could have imagined. It was a fatal blow to the credibility of the Rock.
Alcatraz, being what Alcatraz was, it was a real embarrassment to lose anybody.
Less than a year later, it was closed as a federal prison.
It's hail and farewell to Alcatraz. Wearing handcuffs and leg irons, the last 27 of its 1,500 prisoners leave the crumbling, unsalvageable fortress for more modern federal penitentiaries.
As the once mighty Alcatraz stood empty, 3 inmates remained unaccounted for. Some 50 years on, computer-generated portraits show what the escapees might look like today. US Marshals won't stop looking for them until they reach the age of 100.
In the Marshal Service, we don't close a case until we have absolute proof that we have the subject, dead or alive.
But what of the bones, said to be those of escapee Frank Morris? The DNA test results were finally in.
Okay. Thanks, John. Bye. The DNA lab confirmed that the last DNA sample I sent did not match Frank Morris. I always assumed that was one of the options, but I was kind of hoping that it would not be because I wanted to close out part of the case.
If the bones weren't those of Frank Morris, perhaps they belonged to one of the Anglin brothers, or perhaps they belonged to another unknown person. If so, it would mean that the 2 key records hidden in the FBI archives were right, that the 3 escapees survived the journey across the bay. That footprints were found leading away from the raft, that a car was stolen, and the 3 men inside were the Alcatraz escapees. The real possibility that all 3 fugitives survived only makes Deputy Marshal Michael Dyke more determined to hunt them down.
If I caught any one or all 3 of them, I would tell them, good job, it was a good run, but it's over.
His relentless investigation may one day lead to historic arrests. But for now, whatever happened to the Alcatraz escapees remains one of the most compelling mysteries in criminal history.
Don't miss the brand new series of Mega Factories, continuing with the BMW X3 tomorrow at 9. Stay tuned for history's toughest prisons.